Well, welcome to Christ and Culture. This is Pastor Jeff Short. Glad to have you along for our discussion today. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic that I have been talking about in the past on both this channel and on my other channel, Christian Answers, and that is how much money should a pastor of a local church, especially a larger church, a mega church, be paid? And for that matter, it would apply to denominational church executives, leaders. It would apply to evangelists. It would apply to missionaries. It would apply to ministry leaders. This has come up in the news lately because there have been a number of articles that have called into question the salaries of some of the leading megachurch pastors in our country. And we know that it's not only a church issue, a megachurch issue, it's also a ministry issue. There are a lot of independent ministries in the United States, for example, where the leaders of these independent ministries, whether it's a media company, whether it's a book publishing company, an author of a book, whether it's a parachurch organization, whatever it is related to Christianity, the question is, how much should pastors and church leaders and Christian leaders be paid, and how much should they pay themselves if they're the head of a ministry? Why does this matter? Because we're supposed to represent Christ. We're supposed to present no scandal to the world. We're to present a sincere and honest heart with no mixed motives. No motivations for money and riches and possessions, because after all, we're following in the footsteps of Jesus Christ and the apostles in the New Testament. And if you remember, Jesus ministered and was essentially poor. He didn't have any savings stored up. He didn't own a land or property at all, and he didn't have any of those concerns. He wasn't motivated at all by money. And then you look at the apostles, and there they carry on that same tradition. In fact, Peter and the apostles were going into the Jerusalem temple one day, and someone was sitting there on the steps begging for money. And Peter saw this man. He needed to be healed. And Peter rather said, "Gold and silver have I none, but what I have I give to you. Rise and be healed." And laid his hand on the man, and the man was healed. So we know for a fact that none of the apostles were wealthy. Peter certainly in this instance was not wealthy. He had nothing to give the man. And the apostle Paul, one of the greatest apostles and missionaries and pastors of the Christian church history. And he had to actually work a side job making tents. He was a tent maker, and so he had to earn his keep that way. So he by no means had wealth. So the tradition in Christianity is that the ministers of the gospel are supposed to be motivated by pure the will of God, doing the will of God, serving the will of God, preaching the gospel, teaching God's word, the Bible, and the wealth and the riches of this world, that's to be left to other people. Now, it's perfectly acceptable for the lay people, those who have to go out and earn a living and raise a family and pay the bills. They're free to earn whatever they can and give whatever they can to the church. But the pastors and the church leaders, they're supposed to hold to a higher standard. And actually, it says that there's not to be any kind of hint of impropriety, and they have higher standards to live by than the average layperson. So how do we come at this question of what about these megachurch pastors who own 3 homes and make 6-figure salaries and have net worths of multi-million-dollar net worth? How do we deal with these megachurch pastors? Should they find a way to actually limit their own salary? And we've been hearing that different views on this, but I want to talk about Pastor John Piper of Bethlehem Baptist Church in Minnesota. He has written an article for the Gospel Coalition that's found on the Gospel Coalition website. It's called Piper on Pastors' Pay. So I'm going to bring that up, and we're going to look at John Piper on this issue because I really feel that he has some wisdom to bring to this whole issue. And I've been critical of John Piper in the past few months. I was critical of him when he encouraged Christians a couple weeks before the election to not vote for the President Trump, because of Trump's tweets and his attitude and his past life as a businessman and some of his coarseness and crudeness. And I felt that was wrong of Piper to try to discourage Christians from voting for President Trump because there was no other alternative. And so we now have a radical leftist in the White House. We see him pushing a pro-abortion agenda and a pro-LGBTQ agenda, pro-transgender agenda, just doing all the kinds of things we feared he would do. He's actually doing them. And you have to look at why would men like John Piper encourage Trump to lose? And certainly a Trump victory would have been better than a Biden victory as far as Christian liberties and the freedom of to have our Christian values promoted in the society. So I really feel that John Piper missed the mark in discouraging Christians from voting for Trump. But this video is not about that. The elections are over, and we're going to be talking today about megachurch pastors' salaries, and is it appropriate for megachurch pastors to get big salaries? Is that something becoming of a minister of the gospel? So let's pull up Pastor John Piper's article from the Gospel Coalition. There it is. And we're going to read down here, and I'm going to comment, because this is really, I really feel that this is significant, and we can learn a lot from interacting with John Piper on this issue. So let's jump into it. The article, Piper on Pastors' Pay. And this is by Colin Hansen, who is an assistant to John Piper. And this was written back in 2013, but it still applies to the issues that we're dealing with today. It says, I can't say I relate to reports of pastors earning lavish salaries and building elaborate mansions, but conversations about money and ministry can be just as awkward and frustrating on the other end of the pay scale. For pastors scraping by while working two jobs and churches struggling to meet their obligations, money strains relationships and stretches faith. How do pastors know when they need to ask for more money? How do churches know when they should give it? Such common situations won't attract investigative reporters, but they can cause just about as much consternation. John Piper could have lived large on his book royalties and speaking fees. So why did he choose to live much more like an ordinary pastor during more than 30 years at Bethlehem Baptist Church in Minneapolis? I corresponded with the founder and teacher of Desiring God about hard work, poverty theology, and how he would advise young pastors, and more. So John Piper is an author who's made a lot of impact in the body of Christ here in the United States and in the English-speaking world with his many books that he's written. So he's gotten many, many book deals. He has been the speaker at many, many conferences over the last 30 years. And he has been a successful mega church pastor. There are a lot of people that go to Bethlehem Baptist Church. So there are all kinds of opportunities for him to have been a very wealthy man. And possibly he is a wealthy man still, even though he has made limitations and restrictions on his wealth income. So let's hear what he has to say. Here's the question. When did you first realize you would need some plan to handle the money earned from your speaking and writing? Were you ever tempted to keep the money for yourself? Now, this is the issue that is facing the Christian world today, because there have been a number of investigative reports, one by a woman out in California, a woman in Illinois who used to be on Moody Radio. Her name is Julie Royce, and she has a web page called the Royce Report, and she has done an investigation on some megachurch pastors, and she's raising the question, why are these ministers millionaires? Why are they multimillionaires? We've heard in the last 4 or 5 years that there are some pastors of mega churches, for example, like Bill Hybels at Willow Creek Community Church, who owned or partially owned a private jet that he used to fly from point A to point B. And there are other ministers and pastors of mega churches who actually outright own jet airplanes. There are plenty of pastors of these mega churches who own yachts, who own multiple homes, who are multimillionaires, who have all kinds of travel and ministry expenses that they rack up. And of course, the most important recent scandal was the evangelist and apologist Ravi Zacharias, whose ministry probably brought in at least $10 million a year, and he was known to have been a millionaire himself. So the question is raised, should these ministers of the gospel, the humble servants of Christ, they're also seen as, should they be millionaires and should they be making a lot of money? And Pastor John Piper was faced with this early on in his ministry. What do I do with the money that I've earned from my books and my speaking and my ministry here at the church? Now, one of the common reactions has been to defend these pastors and saying, well, they've earned it. They've earned they work hard and they've used their skills and they deserve what they have earned. There's no shame in hard work, and there's no shame in a man getting what he deserves. And many churches say, well, we've looked at our area and we've looked at the comparable organizations that employ a certain amount of people, that have a certain amount of budget, and this is what a CEO of a corporation would earn, and these pastors are nothing more than a CEO of a nonprofit organization. And so on and so forth. You see different people defending the megachurch pastors' huge salaries. But Pastor John Piper took a different approach, and that approach is very interesting. And I think it's a model for megachurch pastors to think about, or any kind of ministry leader who thinks that their salary might be creeping up to levels where it's getting to be a little dangerous for them to remain the humble servant of Christ that they're supposed to be. Here's what John Piper says. When I began my ministry as a pastor at Bethlehem, it had never entered my mind that I would produce a lot of income by writing. I received modest honorariums on $100 or $200 for weddings and funerals. I accepted these with thanks. I did suspect that if I was faithful, income would rise, and sooner or later, I would make more than I needed. See, that's the important issue for a pastor, any size church, any size ministry. What is it that you and your family actually need? Not how much you can grow. Now, this sort of goes against the old American can-do spirit where you just keep on growing and your salary goes up and up and up, and your income goes up and up and up, and your net worth goes up and up and up, and we almost have this ingrained that that's a good thing, that's a blessing, that's means that we're succeeding, we're doing something right. But see, when you're a pastor, you need to think about not just yourself, but you need to think about your example. And so John Piper did a really great thing, and I think it's a role model for pastors. He said, what would I do if my salary got to the point where it was more than what I needed? Therefore, I believe from the beginning that plans should be in place to put a governor or a limit or a check on laying up treasures on earth. So here he is. And this is wisdom for mega church pastors, for mega ministry leaders, or anyone that has something that's growing. You need to begin to think in terms of, okay, how much is enough for me? And then how much is more than enough? And I don't want to begin to build up too much wealth because that's unbecoming to my ministry. If you want to be a businessman, that's a different thing. That's the whole point of the business, is to grow it, and you will receive the fruit of your labors, and then you can use it for things like donating to the church and donating to mission, and you can be a blessing. But if you're a pastor, you're not a businessman primarily. You're not a CEO, and you have to think differently. And that's what John Piper gets us to do. He says, otherwise, little by little, I might assume that my wants were my needs, and the expenses would expand, as they always do, to fill the income. So Noel, that's his wife, and I put in place a graduated tithe from the beginning. That is, we tried to give a greater percentage with each salary increase, not just a greater amount. So he's doing something, what we know that the pastor out in California, Rick Warren, did after he began to make a lot of money and sell a lot of books from his famous Purpose-Driven Life book. And you probably heard about this book if you're a Christian, because it's on the national bestseller, all-time bestseller. I think it sold more books in the United States than any book outside of the Bible. So this book made a ton of money for the publishing company, but it also made a ton of money for Rick Warren. So he decided that what he was going to do is not just grow rich and not just become exorbitantly rich, but to actually put in place safeguards to begin to limit his own personal income to a reasonable amount. And that is really wise. That's what Pastor John Piper is saying here. With the successful sales of Desiring God, that's his first book, starting in 1987, I saw that there could be a substantial income from writing and speaking. I resolved that I should not keep this money for myself, but channel it to ministry. I never doubted that the Lord would provide us with a salary that would be sufficient for our family, so I saw no reason to keep the money that came in from the books and speaking. These royalties and honorariums were being earned while I was a pastor of Bethlehem Baptist, so it seemed that the church should benefit from them, not me privately. So that is so important. When you see these megachurch pastors of pastoring churches of thousands and thousands of people, and these huge budgets of 10, 20 to 20 million, 5, 10, 20 million dollars a year or more in income, it would really be nice if we knew that the pastor had a cap on his salary, that he is not going to grow his wealth by growing the church. And this has to be done, I believe, with what John Piper was saying, an intentional plan to limit your salary. Now that sounds totally un-American and totally counterintuitive. But if you're a servant of Christ, if you want to maintain the integrity of your office, and you want to have no one question your motives, and you want to not have any stumbling blocks, which is the Greek word for scandal, scandalon. If you don't want to have a scandal, and you don't want anyone to stumble, and you don't want anyone to get the wrong impression of you, you must cap your ministry salary to a reasonable amount. And there's nothing wrong with that, because when you have enough to meet your needs, and when you have a comfortable salary, then you have enough and you don't need to go any further. There's no need to go and build a bigger and better home. There's no need to get a bigger and better car. If you've already have a nice home that you can live in, it's meet your needs. You don't have to wear fancier clothes. You don't have to eat more expensive food, dine out at more expensive restaurants. You don't have to do that. You're not trying to prove anything to anyone. You're not trying to impress anyone. You're trying to be a man of God. You're pastoring a church. You're keeping your eye on the ball. You're keeping focused on what your priorities are. You're not getting distracted by money and possessions. And, we have all these warnings in the Bible that Jesus said. He said, it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a little needle, than it is for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. So that's a warning. That's a warning. And it's a warning to pastors too. And just because they have grown a big church and grown a big ministry, it doesn't mean they deserve to be rich. And in fact, it says in the Bible, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evils. So all of these warnings that we have in the New Testament and the Old Testament, in the book of Proverbs, and all over the place, we need to listen to those. Pastors should not have to be taught this. They should be already teaching this. So it's a matter of they need to apply what they're teaching from the pulpit. And I believe a lot of these guys are teaching this from the pulpit. They just don't seem to apply it to their own situation properly. At first, I thought I could do this simply by channeling the royalties to the church, but I realized soon that it had tax implications. Since these royalties were technically in my control as the copyright holder, giving all of them to the church made me liable for income tax. So that's a problem. So they're in the books that he writes in his name are selling like hotcakes, and he's getting the money. So he thought, well, I'll get the money and I'll just give it to the church. But still, he's getting taxed on that money. So that's gonna drive him into poverty if he does that. So he has to come up with a better solution. So we created a foundation, and that's a good idea. I think Pastor Rick Warren out there in Saddleback Church, California, has created a foundation. I think John MacArthur out there in California has created a foundation. So you have to do things like create a foundation and get your money into the foundation so it's not personally to you, that you're not amassing wealth. The foundation has a board of governors so they can keep it accountable. It's really wise. The Desiring God Foundation now owns all the copyrights of my books and intellectual property and receives and distributes all the income. I have no access to the money at all. I do sit on the board of the foundation with my wife and 5 others. This board safeguards the aims of the foundation and makes the decisions to which the ministries, the income should be given. It's a thrilling ministry. So that's a great idea. We made the decision that all honoraria would go to the ministries we represent, not ourselves. That was usually the church while I was a pastor, and now is Desiring God. That is his foundation. While I was a pastor of Bethlehem, I never received an income from Desiring God. So he didn't earn any money from his book and his radio ministry. So for the last 25 years or so, we have lived on one stream of income. That's very important because a lot of these guys, they get book royalties, they get speaking fees, they get radio and television income, they get conference appearances, they get their salary from the church. They're getting all these revenue streams, and yeah, you get rich when you have a lot of revenue streams. So for the last 25 years, we've lived on one stream of income. And that is still the case, as I am now paid by Desiring God. So his foundation now pays him a modest salary. I have never been in any serious need. None of this has felt like a sacrifice. I know myself incredibly rich by the standards of the world. Beyond all doubt, it is more blessed to give than to receive. So, and then there's the question, and there are more questions, and I can see that this will take one more episode, but we're going to leave it here for today. But I just wanted to talk about this question because it needs to be asked. A lot of the problems of these megachurch pastors could be solved by simply putting into place a plan how you can cap your salary, cap your income, limit your wealth accumulation. Now, that sounds crazy to the average American. It sounds crazy to the average businessman or anyone other than people in ministry, but it really is an issue in ministry because, again, we live in a very skeptical age. And we don't need to have any scandals. We don't need to have any people rejecting Christianity or the gospel or the church because they're looking at the size of the church and saying, boy, I bet you that guy, that pastor, that preacher, I bet you he's a millionaire many times over because of the people here and the budget. And, to be honest, actually, that is the case, that there are plenty of pastors of mega churches who are getting rich off their ministry. And that is a disgraceful thing to say. Can you imagine meeting a pastor who is a millionaire and someone asking him, how did you make your million? And the pastor has to sheepishly say, well, I made it on my church. I made it from ministry. Serving the Lord made me a millionaire. That's not what a pastor needs to say, and that's not what a pastor should ever have to say or even have to confess. And the way he should have dealt with that is to say, I am not a millionaire, and I don't make a lot of money. I'm content with what I have, and the reason I don't have a lot of money and I don't have a lot of earthly wealth is, first of all, that money is a temptation, and long ago I limited my income and capped it, or as you heard John Piper say, he put a governor on it. It's like a lawnmower. There's a governor on a lawnmower so the engine doesn't rev up too high and actually explode. And that's a good illustration because a lot of these megachurch pastors who make six-figure or $1 million salaries, they are very much at risk of exploding because money is a temptation. It's one of the major temptations that we all have to face. And it's something that can lead us astray. It can lead us into sin, greed, accumulating wealth. There's just so many problems with money. That's why pastors need to stay away from it as much as possible. And one of the best ways, and what John Piper started to explain here, and we'll finish this up the next episode, what he started to explain is that he and his church and his elders and his ministry, Desiring God, got together and decided, hey, we're going to put a limit on John Piper, his income, personal income. And so basically, I'm sure they sat down together and said, okay, what is a reasonable, comfortable income for John and his family? And let's pay him that much. And then anything in excess that comes in, we channel into the foundation or the church here, so that this money is not making him into a rich man and all the problems and temptations that produces in a person's life. So he doesn't have to be distracted by all this money and trying to make decisions about what to do with it and where to park his millions and all this kind of stuff. So nobody needs that. But we're going to continue next on the next episode of Christ and Culture, talking more about this. We'll finish up the article, but this is something to think about, and I think all pastors need to work through this whole scenario. Well, we'll see you back next week on another edition of Christ and Culture. God bless.